Okay, young ladies, if y'all could come up here, I'm going to give y'all each a balloon this morning. And I'm actually going to have one also. There you go. If you do this, sometimes it makes it easier to blow them up so y'all can stretch them out. Go ahead and see if y'all can blow those things up and blow them up pretty big. We need to have those things pretty big this morning, so we're going to give y'all a right one. And woo, you're struggling there a little bit, aren't you? Should we get that thing started for you? Let's put this thing in here like this. How about this?
I can do that.
Hold on to that really tight. Go ahead and blow it up, okay? Are you being able to blow it up at all, Angela? Too much. Okay. Well, that's okay. We'll let you use this too. Okay, give that to Angela and put that on that thing and we'll we want these pretty big this morning, so what I want you to do then, you hold this, Heather, while I get a piece of tape, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, I was going to do a little lesson with y'all this morning. How many of y'all out there know how a balloon is made? Anybody? Have you ever done any research on how a balloon is made? That's good, Carla. That's good. That's a lot easier than. Let me tie it for you. Can you tie yours, Carla? Or not? Here, you hold this. There you go. Have any of y'all know how a balloon is made? It's the neatest thing. Okay, we're going to put this over here, Angela. What it does, they have these wood, it looks like wooden pieces that look just like a balloon. And there's hundreds of them, and they go, yeah, you hold that one. After church then, after church I'll let you have that balloon and we'll blow it up and you can have one. Okay, y'all can go back. Well, these things go down this, they're on almost like a conveyor belt. And they go down there and they dip. These things dip into this liquid. It's this liquid that dips in and they're spinning. And these balloons are on these things and they're kind of filled out about like this here. When they get down toward the end, they have a little brush. It almost looks like some kind of cleaning brush. And them things are spinning really fast, and that's what makes the ends of a balloon. Well, it's the same process they use to make these. It's a latex that they use to make these gloves, but they're hands that dip down in there. They're wooden hands or plastic hands, and all this stuff comes off, and then they twirl these at the end. And I thought about blowing this one up. They used to do this for me when I was in the hospital. I'll show you a little bit how they look. The nurses would always do this for me, and if you look at this thing, it kind of looks like a rooster there, you know, it spouts there, then they put eyes and a mouth on it and stuff. But what we'd like to talk about, and I'd like to look at this morning, is the life of Queen Esther. And I guess the name of my talk, maybe a two-part title for the sermon this morning is, whose voice are you listening to? What are you being filled with? And as we look at, I do need to blow one more up, so give me just a second here. We've got one more here that we're going to put out here because we need 4 of them up here this morning. But I'd like to turn this morning to Esther, and I'd like to read out of Esther 1. For some of us, this story is very, very, very familiar. We've heard it since we were children. How that Esther her parents passed away, they died, and Mordecai took her in as his own. And this book of the Bible, one of the only books of the Bible that does not have the name of God or Jesus in it. But it's based so much on God's Word. And I'd like to read Esther 1, verses 10 through 12. And as we go through this, remember the title of the lesson: whose voice are you listening to, and what are you being filled with? Esther 1, starting at verse 10. It goes like this. On the 7th day, in the heart of the king, and the king here, Ahasuerus, threw a great party, and he wanted his queen, Vashti, to come before him. He was drunk, and he was basically trying to show her off. And this is where the story begins. And it goes like this. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded his 7 chamberlains, I'm not going to say the names, that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with a crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. But when the queen Vashti refused to come to the king's commandment by his chamberlains, therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Here we have a king that was basically drunk, throwing a great big party for his people, and he's wanting to parade his wife, so to speak, before all these people, and she refused to do that. And as we go down into this story, setting this picture up, let's read verses 15 to 22, and it goes like this. She said no, and then it says, what shall we do unto the queen Vashti, according to the law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? And Memucan answered before the king and princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are over the provinces of the king of Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, and then it shall be reported that King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen. Thus shall they arise too much contempt and wrath, and if it please the queen, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her a royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all his empire for his great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to the great and to the small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. And he sent letters unto the king's provinces, and to every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and it should be published according to the language of every people. So what would happen if I stopped at this point in the story? What would you say? That'll teach the women to do what their husbands say. And as we look at this story, that story doesn't stop there, but it goes on. And sometimes we wonder why God brings situations into our country, into our lives. I mean, the question that I have to ask is, God, why is my cousin Parker struggling right now? An 11-year-old boy with leukemia. Why is he in the hospital right now? What is the reason? And as we look at this story, if we would stop that story right there, some people would say the lady got what she deserved. Let's move on in life. But the story doesn't stop there. God's using this particular instance to change the life of a country. I guess my question to you as we go through the rest of this story here, do you believe that God is in control of everything that takes place in your life? Can you trust God to be in control of every area of your life? Let's go on now, chapter 2. We're going to read the first 18 verses. It says, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be a fair young virgin sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers of the provinces of the kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, of the house of the women unto the custody of Hegai, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden that pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti, and the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away from Jeconiah, king of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and the decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also into the king's house to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and speedily gave her things for purification, which such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to be given her out of the king's house, and he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. And when every maid's turn was come to go to the king Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months according to the manner of women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given her, to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and in the morrow she returned into the second house of the women in the custody of Jaashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, had been taken her for his daughter, was come to go into the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus, unto the house royal in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than any of the virgins. And he set a royal crown upon her head, and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces, and gave gifts according to the state of the king. Okay, what would happen if the story stopped here? What would you think? If you didn't know what the rest of the story was like, what would you think? You'd kind of like to be that person, right, young ladies? 12 months of being doted upon, given whatever you wanted. This would be a little bit like, maybe in our modern day time, Esther here, Queen Esther now, became Miss America. She was the best of the best. Maybe this could even be compared to Miss Universe, best of every country. I mean, this lady was given the royal treatment. What would you think if you were Esther? You were chosen from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of contestants. It doesn't say how many and how long this took, but you were the elite of all the ladies in your province. You think you would become pretty full of yourself? Could that happen? You think maybe you could say, hey, I was chosen out of all of these people. I'm pretty special. Full of air. Like these balloons up here this morning, you could kind of be pretty full of yourself there. And just full of air. They're full. There's no problem with that. But all these balloons here are just as full as they can be. But when we fill ourselves with ourselves, when we're filled with just us, that's basically what we are. Just a bunch of air. What happens when God fills us? What takes place in our life? Let's take a look then, jumping on down into verse 3 in chapter 3. Going on into this story, we read this, what happened, and then Esther became queen, and then Haman comes onto the scene. Now this was a man that was 100% full of himself. He wanted the Jews killed. He had a law made. He had all of this stuff brought before him because he hated these people. When he walked out of the palace, he became second in command. He walked out of the palace. He wanted everyone to bow down to him. Haman was 100% full of air. He had nothing of God in his life. There was no substance there. Jumping on down into the chapter, going over to chapter 4, it says, then the first 2 verses, it says, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, talking about this, when this decree was made, Haman used the king's signet ring to stamp it, and it was a law that all the Jews would be killed on a certain day. It says, when Mordecai perceived that all this was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud voice and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. Here was a man in mourning, knowing that his life was fixing to be taken from these people. As we jump down in verse 6 through 8, it says, Esther asked one of the gentlemen to go and see what was going on. So Hatak went forth to Mordecai and into the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai had told him all that had happened unto him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. And he also gave them a copy of the writing of the decree that was given unto Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and declare unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and make a request before him for her people. Here we have a young lady that was in a palace. She had been doted on for a year. She had whatever she wanted. She had all kinds of people surrounding her, giving her whatever she wanted. What could her response been? Do you think Esther was full of air? Let's go down to 12 and 14, and it said, and they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shouldst escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace in this time, Then shall there an enlargement of deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. And thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to this kingdom for such a time as this. Here Esther was. She was wanting to be filled, not with air. That wasn't part of her life. She wanted to be filled with a substance. Hopefully this glass jar will break. I have some rocks here and I have a glass jar, so we're gonna try to get these rocks in here this morning. They fit last night, so hopefully it'll be full when they go in this morning. Okay, you girls that were up here, is this glass jar full? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It's full. Okay. So you think there's some substance there? How would do you think there's more to this jar than there was in that balloon? There's a lot more substance. So you're saying this is full. So you're saying Esther was, we're going to say this is Esther, and she was filled with God. She done something. She asked everyone to fast and pray that God would lead her, because if she had to go in before the king, she could have her head cut off right then if the king wasn't happy to see her. But she let God become part of her life, and she was filled. We're going to say those rocks are, this jar is Esther, and these rocks are representing Christ. But you say that she is filled. Do you think she could get more full? Not very much. Maybe we could get another rock in here. We'll see. We're going to get that pretty much. Okay, that's pretty full now. Okay, let's go on into the story. So here we popped Haman here. He was full of air, and we got him out of the way almost. But as we go on into the story, let's go to chapter 5. The first two verses. It says like this: Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house, and the king sat upon the royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out unto Esther his golden scepter, and that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of her scepter. So do you think the reason the king didn't cut her head off or kill her was because she was pretty, or do you think it's because she fasted and prayed that God would be in control? Do you think so? Because God was in control. So you think she was filled with God, right? Okay. So she wasn't full of air. Is that what we're saying? She wasn't full of air, so we're gonna pop another one. So here we go again. So you think we can fill this one up a little bit more?
No.
You don't think so? Well, sometimes God is able to fill us up a little bit more so than what we think, right? So we're going to see if we can fill this jar up a little bit more. How about that? Does it get more full? I thought you said we couldn't fill it up more. So God's filling. Wow, look at that. That's just pretty full, isn't it? So y'all think that's really full now? That's really full now, isn't it? God used Esther and filled her up with the substance. So what do you think is the heaviest? Do you think this is the heaviest, or one of those balloons is the heaviest? This is? You think this? So if I threw this at you, or I threw a balloon at you, which one would you rather catch?
That one.
You would rather catch this one. It's going to break maybe. That would be a lot lighter, don't you think? But this is what we're talking about. God filled her up even more because she obeyed God's voice. Now let's go to chapter 8. This story continues on. And we know that how the story goes. Esther here went before the king and had him come over for supper, had Haman come along also. And as the story goes, Esther made a request to the king, and she said, this wicked Haman that is sitting here today made a decree that my people, she said, I'm a Jew. She let the king know that. She said, I'm a Jew. And he wants to kill my people. Well, the king was just upset. And he had Haman thrown out, and eventually he had Haman killed on his own gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. But as we look at this, let's go to chapter 8. And we're going to read the first 6 verses. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jews' enemy unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet. He saw him with tears, and put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised unto the Jews. And the king held out his golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and he said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in your sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in the king's province. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people, and how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Do you think Esther was full of air, or do you think she was full of God?
God.
So we need to pop another balloon, right? So you think we can get this jar more full? God's filling her up some more. You think we can get that jar more? What do you think we can do to make that jar more full? What do you think? More sand? No, let's try something else. If God fills us up, God's going to fill us up completely. It's going to take a while for that to happen, but God's going to fill us up. What do you think? We're going to let that settle. So you think that jar's getting more full than what it was? But y'all said it was full with rocks. Then y'all said it was full of sand. So is it getting more full? So what happens when God fills our lives up? He doesn't just fill us up partially. And when God fills us up, there's not gaps in there like there was with the rocks. There's even some gaps in there with the sand. That looked pretty full with the sand in there. And it's going down in there. You can see that it's filling this jar right on up. And here in just a little bit, we're going to be pretty full. But as we look at the story, as the story goes on, the very last chapter here in Esther goes like this, chapter 10. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of the power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? And Mordecai the Jew was next unto the king Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and respected of the multitude of his brothers, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. What would have happened we're going to do this. That's full. That thing falls, we're in trouble. It's gonna break if it falls. But we're not gonna let it fall there. But as we think of listening to God's voice, as we think of being filled with God, which one would you rather be filled with if God was in your life? This one here. I mean, it's full to the brim. And as I was studying for this, what kind of got me down thinking this line, a good friend of mine sent me a story. It was a link on YouTube. And it was a story told of David Gibbs Jr. And I'm going to finish with this story today. It touched me as we think of being filled with God, as we think about being filled with the Spirit of God. And as I started off, being filled with God, who are we listening to? We're listening to the voice of God. The story goes like this. David was up there in Alaska on some business. He's a lawyer. And him and another gentleman were fixing to fly home. And as they were there, he said, I had my plane ticket in my hand, fixing to head home for this big, nice jet. And he said, a preacher friend of mine comes up and he said, David, he said, I would like you and this other gentleman to come fly with me. He said, I'm flying by myself, and he said, I'd really like to take you and this gentleman with me. I love to fly. I've got a nice plane. And David said, no, he said, we're good. We got our tickets, we're ready to go. And it's like, the man finally convinced him to come along. So David said he went there, and he said, it was a small plane. He said, here we are in Alaska. And he said, first thing I saw when I saw this plane, it was sleek. It was nice. He said he had it waxed up. He said it was polished. He said it was a beautiful plane. And he said, well, this is good. And he said, as we were going down the runway, David asked him, he said, can we pray? Josh said, sure. He said, not a problem. He said, I usually don't, but he said, you're welcome. And he said, Brian, and he did say Brian, he said, I told the gentleman, he said, we're going to pray. So he said, he stopped there, and he said, I began to pray, and he said, I prayed about every aspect of that airplane, that this thing would get us where we needed to go. And he said, as in Alaska happens sometimes, he said, we take off. He said it was a perfect takeoff. He said everything was going smooth. And he said, happens in Alaska sometimes, clouds begin to settle in. And he said, the gentleman looked at me and my companion. He said, we might have a problem today. David said, well, what's this? He said, the plane was humming just as smooth as it could go. He said, we might have a problem. He said, when I get into clouds, he said, I have a tendency of passing out. David said his eyes got big, and he said, clouds were beginning to settle in. He said, we get up and we go through the clouds, and he said, all of a sudden the plane dips a little bit, and he said, I look over, and he said his eyes are rolling back in his head. He said, I grab the man and I shake him for all I was worth, and nothing happens. He said, I almost shook him hard enough to kill him, but he said nothing happened. He said he passed out. And he said, I look at the gentleman in the back. He said, I got a hold of this steering wheel. I had no clue. He said, I grabbed a hold of the yoke. I had no clue what I was doing. Just held on. And he said, I looked at the man in the back, and he looked at me. He said, what are we going to do, David? David said, I had no clue. But he said, we got to have help. David said, I reached up and grabbed this mic. And he said, I handed it to the guy, and he said, see if we can find out where we're at, what we got to do. He said, I had no clue what I was doing. This guy picks up the mic, and he says, hello, hello. Not proper airplane etiquette. Hello, hello. He said, a little bit later, he said, a gentleman comes on, and he said, can I ask what's going on? He said, sounds to me like y'all don't know what's going on. He said, y'all, where are y'all at? What's going on? And he said, we told him, we said, we're flying. He said, the pilot just passed out and we don't know what we're doing. He said, well, I'm a freighter flying out of Alaska headed to wherever it was. And he said, I'm going to start circling so I keep contact with you. And he said, I'm going to get you in contact with the airport in Anchorage. He said, well, good. He said, a little bit later, he said, a voice comes on and said, this is Anchorage Flight Tower, so-and-so. And he said, I have a message that you men are having troubles. And they said, yes, sir. They said, we are having serious troubles. We don't know what to do. And he said, well, he said, we're trying to get your location pinned down. And he said, we just need you to keep talking. A little bit later, he comes on. He said, we got your location pinned down. And he said, whatever you do, he said, listen to my voice. He said, I'm going to bring you in. But he said, you have to listen to my voice. And he said, as they were flying along there, he said, you're fixing to come to a big mountain. He said, this is what I need you to do. I need you to bank left and walk him through that step. He said, we cannot. He said, you're going to have to. He said, you're going to crash into a mountain. He said, please listen to my voice. If you don't listen to my voice, you're going to crash. He said, they were a couple hours away from the Anchorage airport. And he said, we turned around and we were headed back. And he said, this gentleman followed us through. He said, the storm was brewing around us. The gentleman told me, he said, listen, you're going to be going through storms. He said, but whatever you do, don't look outside. Don't look at the storms that are around you. He said, just listen to my voice. He said, they flew back for a couple hours, and he said, this gentleman was walking us through some of the steps to take place as we come to Anchorage. And he said, we flew for 2 hours, and he said, the storm was beating this little plane up. He said, we were jerking and we were flopping. And he said, but I just listened to the gentleman's voice. And the man told him, he said, you're doing great. Everything's going great. He said, but coming up here directly, he said, I need you to start dropping your speed a little bit, and I need you to begin to lower your altitude. He said, you're coming close to the Anchorage airport. And he said, you're going to be coming to an airport. And he said, when you get out of the clouds, he said, you're going to be several hundred feet in the air because the storm clouds are in. He said, but I want you to look for the cross. He said, at the end of that runway is a cross. He said, there's lights in the form of a cross. He said, hit the center of that cross. And he said, follow that cross. He said, as he dropped me down further and further and further, and I'm getting closer and closer, and the gentleman's talking to me, and he said, David, just listen to my voice. He said, during this flight, he said, I had a bunch of men came on. They were freighters that were flying cargo from Alaska to other parts of the world in the States. These men said, sir, whatever you do, listen to that gentleman. He's going to bring you in. He said, as we approached the runway, he said, I'm scared to death. And he said, as I bring this thing down a couple feet above the runway, and he said, I landed this thing. He said, actually, I landed it 7 times. He said, you don't know if the jerking woke the pilot up, but he looks over and the pilot's waking up. But he said, I landed this airplane, and he said, the gentleman came over the radio, and he said, David, thank you for listening to my voice. He said, this has happened before, and he said, men don't listen to my voice. And he said, they've crashed and they've died. This is what the gentleman said. He said, I watch planes crash and burn all the time because they won't follow my voice. They don't understand I'm the one who can see them, even though they can't see me. But they get the voices in their head and they kill themselves. They self-destruct. Thanks for listening to my voice. They put him up in a motel room that night. And they said they were laying there, they were asleep, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, I get a knock on the door. The gentleman came to the door and he said, yes, can I help you? He said, yes, I just wanted to see you. And David said, that's the voice. And the gentleman said, yes, I am that voice. I'm the man that brought you down. One day, you will hear a voice. Will you be like Esther? Will you be filled to the top? Or will you be filled with air? Go wherever you want to go. What will God say when you make it home? Will he say, well done, thou good and faithful servant? Hope that has been a challenge to you today. As we listen to God's voice, as we go through our life, are we going to be filled completely to the brim? And God's voice is going to be part of our life. Or are we going to be like that balloon just out there, wherever the wind takes us? I pray that this has been a challenge to you as it's been to me. Are we listening to God's voice? Let's pray. God, I thank you for your love. I thank you, Lord, for the opportunity that we have to gather in this way. Lord, I pray that you would help us to listen to your voice. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be filled with concern for more than ourselves like Esther was. She was able to listen to the voice of her uncle and to listen to God. And she was able to save the people from total destruction. God, I pray that you would help us to be those kind of people that are able to put your word into other people's lives. God, just go with us today. I pray, Lord, also that you would bless them in your labor. I pray, Lord, that you would bless them to our bodies. Go with us today. In your name I pray.